Obito, Itachi, and Nagato. At one point in time, these guys were the 3 strongest shinobi alive without question. Even the legendary Sannin, who were hyped up as being rivals to the 5 Kage, the absolute peak of the ninja world, still had no chance when facing shinobi of this caliber. But what if these 3 titans of the Akatsuki were to face off against the most powerful shinobi in history, Hashirama Senju? That's the question I'll be answering today, and to make it so that Team Akatsuki can put up a decent fight, I will be using their War Arc forms. This means that Nagato gets to keep the 8 Tails chakra he absorbed from B, Itachi can use Mangekyo techniques without restraint due to the Edo Tensei constantly regenerating his body, and Obito has both the Rinnegan and the Geto Mazo at his disposal. Additionally, since Hashirama technically doesn't have a method of sealing away Edo Tensei, I will consider it a win if he's able to completely incapacitate the trio like he did against Madara during the 4th Great Shinobi War. But before we get into all the intricacies of how this fight would go, I do want to address the idea that Hashirama is so much faster than the Akatsuki members that he can simply blitz them all to win the fight. This is an argument that's made pretty much any time there is a significant power gap between 2 characters. And in Naruto specifically, whenever someone says that a fight just ends in a blitz, there's a very big chance that they're completely wrong. That being said, it is true that Hashirama is extremely fast because he can keep up with Madara, who in the War Arc physically reacts to KCM2 Naruto shadow clones and even uses wood style to trap the original Naruto's avatar. And when you compare this to the Akatsuki trio, who are all shown to be physically relative to KCM1 Naruto, this seems to be an open and shut case. However, Obito himself throws a wrench in this topic because we see that he has pretty similar speed feats to Edo Madara, with him also being capable of physically lunging forward to ensnare KCM2 Naruto with wood style, mentally reacting to Naruto's chakra arms, and even using fire style in a combo attack alongside Madara and the Ten Tails, the latter of which is considered to be fast by Naruto himself. I will say, the Jubi's tails seem to be much slower than its regular combat speed, since pretty much everyone is reacting to those, but we see that in the combo attack with Obito and Madara, it was using its arm, which means that Obito can straight up use ninjutsu at a pace that even KCM2 Naruto considers to be quick. This seemingly poses a pretty big problem, since as I mentioned earlier, KCM1 Naruto was having no problem keeping up with Obito speed-wise. But I think this just goes to show that the speed gap between KCM1 and KCM2 Naruto isn't really that big. Don't get me wrong, KCM2 Naruto is obviously faster due to having access to a way larger pool of chakra. I'm not denying that at all, but what I am saying is that anyone who has shown the ability to fight at the same speed as KCM1 Naruto definitely isn't getting blitzed outright by KCM2. I think Killer B is actually the best example of this being the case, since despite the fact that he punches at the same speed as KCM1 Naruto while fully transformed, he was still capable of keeping up with KCM2 very well in the fight against the Ten Tails. We see that B can keep pace with Naruto here, since they both shield themselves from the Ten Tails Biju bombs simultaneously, and B is also capable of firing his own Biju bombs back at roughly the same rate as Naruto. To be fair to Naruto, he does fire 5 Biju bombs here, as opposed to B who only uses 4, which does show that Naruto is the faster of the two. But the main point is that B is still very relevant in this fight and not really lagging behind at all, despite only having KCM1 level combat speed. So, despite the fact that Itachi and Nagato have only shown the ability to keep up with KCM1 Naruto, I think that's still enough to at least be capable of somewhat reacting to Hashirama's attacks. Obviously, Hashirama is going to be the fastest one in this fight due to being on par with KCM2 in speed, but it's still completely unprovable that the speed gap between him and the trio is big enough for the fight to immediately end in a blitz, which is the point I'm really trying to drive home here. Although, despite the fact that the speed advantage Hashirama has isn't overwhelming, in terms of power, it's a completely different story. I'm sure you all know how ridiculously strong Hashirama is, so I'm not gonna waste a ton of time going over it. All you really need to know is that even in base form, Hashirama is capable of fighting the full Ninetales, with the 4th data book noting that they were evenly matched. And when he enters Sage mode, Hashirama can take on Madara, combining his power with the Kyuubi to form the majestic attire Susanoo and punch off its armor. This is particularly relevant because even Naruto's chakra avatar was incapable of breaking through a weaker version of Madara Susanoo and needed the other tailed beasts to help him deal significant damage. In comparison, Itachi is stated to be equal to EMS Sasuke, who in the War Arc is relative to a weaker version of Naruto. Nagato said that he couldn't have even imagined how strong half the Ninetales could be, and Obito got physically overpowered by a KCM2 Naruto that was being actively suppressed by Wood Style. This means that if Hashirama ever lands one of his harder hitting jutsu against these guys, they're pretty much guaranteed to be cooked. Plus, Itachi, Nagato, and Obito probably don't have enough raw power to destroy him through sheer force, since Sage Mode Hashirama came out of an explosion created by the majestic attire Susanoo's Biju bombs and his own 1,000-armed statue looking completely unharmed. This implies that either A, Hashirama's body is tough enough to take minimal damage from this ridiculously massive explosion, or B, Hashirama's regeneration is fast enough to make it look like he took no damage from this clash, despite the explosion being on the same page. Given that there is no blood on Hashirama's armor or the surrounding area, I would say that him taking no significant damage is the much more likely interpretation. But even if you think that he just regenerated, it still leads to the conclusion that the trio can't put Hashirama down with sheer force due to how insanely fast he can recover. So, the only real way that the Akatsuki trio can hope to beat Hashirama is through their unique abilities, which is why, like most matchups in Naruto, analyzing how their jutsu would interact with each other is the most important part of the fight. Hashirama's most destructive wood-style ninjutsu are his avatars, which would normally guarantee him a victory against 99% of shinobi, but that isn't the case in this fight because of Obito's ability to phase. Using Kamui, he can make both himself and, more importantly, anyone else he's touching completely intangible, which is shown in the 5 Kage Summit when both him and Sasuke are able to phase through an attack from the Raikage. And it's not like this was a one-off mistake by Kishimoto either, since in the War Arc, Obito uses Kamui to make his Gunbai phase through rocks in order to catch Naruto off guard, showing that it can be done with things other than himself. This means that as long as Nagato and Itachi stay relatively close to Obito, he should be able to grab them both to make all 3 of them phase whenever Hashirama tries to go for a massive attack. Of course, Obito does have the weakness of only being able to phase for 5 minutes at a time, but Hashirama has no way of knowing this, so it would be extremely silly and out of character for him to keep attacking for 5 minutes straight without stopping for a literal second when he sees that it clearly isn't working. Plus, in addition to being the only major line of defense against Hashirama's strongest attacks, Kamui is also one of the only ways to take him down. After all, Hashirama has no space-time ninjutsu, so if Obito warps him into the Kamui dimension, it's a complete wrap. Even Minato came close to falling for this trap on the night of the Nine Tails attack, and he would have straight up lost if it weren't for the flying Raijin barely bailing him out on time. This shows that even the Kamui of a teenage Obito is ridiculously quick, which means that if Hashirama is caught in the Kamui of a much stronger Obito, he may not be fast enough to evade it. Although, this tactic is far from guaranteed to work since Obito has to materialize and grab his opponent in order to warp them into his dimension, which means that if Hashirama decides to throw a haymaker, instead of trying to escape the portal, Obito would be forced to phase and cancel the jutsu to stop himself from getting obliterated. As for the Geto Mazo, it should be obvious that Hashirama would have absolutely no problem dealing with it, since he could throw hands with the majestic attire Susanoo, as opposed to the Geto statue, which Obito felt the need to protect from KCM1 Naruto's Rasengan, implying that it is generally on a much lower level than Hashirama. So, even though Obito is essentially the only thing keeping the trio from getting squished off rip, he doesn't really have any concrete way to take Hashirama down, and the same thing goes for Nagato. To be fair to Nagato, Hashirama has never seen the Rinnegan abilities before, which means that he will be pretty likely to get caught off guard by a lot of its abnormal techniques, but this doesn't change the fact that the Rinnegan abilities that rely on raw power won't be doing much here. This includes stuff like the Ashura Path, the summons that rely on brute force, and even Chibaku Tensei. That last one may sound a little contentious, but the reality is that even if Hashirama fails to realize that he has to target the core in order to stop the jutsu, he could easily bust out of it anyways, since Pain's Shibaku Tensei completely failed to hold half of Kurama, and even though Edo Nagato is stronger than Pain, there's still just no evidence that he's become powerful enough to seal away Hashirama. This doesn't mean that Nagato's Diva Path is useless though, because the ability to push Hashirama away with Shinra Tensei and pull him in with Bancho Tenin are both invaluable methods of pressing him. People may point to Six Tails Naruto being capable of resisting Shinra Tensei, but this ignores the fact that he accomplished this by sticking his tails into the ground to anchor him, which just isn't something Hashirama can do, despite obviously being much stronger. However, it is worth pointing out that this is only really useful if Hashirama decides to fight up close and personal, because it should go without saying that Hashirama's larger wood constructs that can tangle with the Nine Tails aren't getting pushed or pulled very far by Nagato. As for the animal path, I think the two summons that are actually somewhat interesting for Hashirama to deal with are the dog that multiplies every time it's hit and the invisible chameleon. But Hashirama does have concrete counters to both of these summons, because even though he can't permanently destroy the dogs outright, Hashirama is the undisputed king of chakra suppression outside of 6 Paths tier characters, so he can just use his wood style to completely incapacitate them without having to directly take the dogs down. And Jiraiya was shown to be capable of sensing the chameleon with a barrier, which means that there shouldn't be anything stopping Hashirama from doing the same thing with Sage Mode to prevent being caught off guard. The only other thing Nagato could potentially do to beat Hashirama is use the human path to rip out his soul, but the issue with this is that in order for it to actually work, Hashirama would have to lose a chakra tug of war, which just isn't happening. This means that like Obito, even though Nagato is going to be pretty useful for at least stalling Hashirama and forcing him to reach deeper in his bag to deal with the Rinnegan abilities, Nagato doesn't have a concrete method to take him down. That being said, it's time to go over the abilities of the member of the trio who probably provides the most in terms of offense, which is Itachi. This might seem a bit surprising, but I think that when paired with the pressure Obito and Nagato can put on Hashirama, Itachi has one ability in particular that actually has a shot at catching him off guard and winning. Before I get into that though, I do want to talk about why I think the Amaterasu and Tsukuyomi in particular wouldn't be very useful against Hashirama. Starting with Amaterasu, the only reason why it isn't a great win condition here is because most characters become capable of reacting to it when they reach a high enough level. We know this since when Sasuke used Amaterasu in the past, both Bee and Danzo were capable of raising their limbs to try and block the flames, while the Raikage was fast enough to dodge them outright. To be fair, Itachi's Amaterasu is obviously much faster and stronger than Sasuke's at this point in the series, but Sage Mode Hashirama also possesses way better sensory and reaction speed than everyone else I just mentioned, which means that he should be capable of evading it or even blocking with his wood style if Itachi tries to use the black flames. And when it comes to Tsukuyomi, even though I don't think it would be particularly effective, there are definitely good arguments worth bringing up for why the Genjutsu could potentially take Hashirama out. In part 1, Itachi states that it is impossible to break out of his Genjutsu unless you have a Sharingan as well as Uchiha blood, which Kakashi backs up by saying that against Itachi's Mangekyo, whether or not you have the ability to break out of regular Genjutsu doesn't matter. However, the issue with these statements is that neither Itachi nor Kakashi know that someone as strong as Hashirama has ever existed, since it's noted by Kabuto that Hashirama's true power was considered to be a fairy tale similar to the Sage of Six Paths. The reason why Hashirama's raw power is relevant here is because when Jiraiya initially teaches Naruto how to break out of Genjutsu, it is stated that the more powerful someone is, the easier they can break out of a Genjutsu. This isn't mentioned in Viz's official translation of the series, but when you look at the actual Japanese and even fan translations made at the time, Jiraiya specifies that if a shinobi can disrupt their chakra with more power than was originally put into the Genjutsu, they can break free. So, in order to argue that Tsukuyomi would work against Hashirama, you have to argue that the chakra of Itachi's Mangekyo is more powerful than Hashirama's ability to affect his own. And for those who are doubting my explanation, I also think it serves as a good way to explain why Hashirama has no qualms about looking Madara directly in the eye, despite the fact that he does have very potent Mangekyo Genjutsu. Hashirama is unironically just too powerful to try to place under an illusion. But Itachi does still have the trump card I alluded to earlier, which is the Susanoo. Specifically, both the Totsuka Blade and Yaramir will be incredibly effective against Hashirama, because it's stated by Black Zetsu that they can cut and block anything. This is also backed up in the third data book, which says the exact same thing. And even though you can rightfully point out that this guidebook only covers up to volume 43, it doesn't really matter because it specifically states that even a literal god would be incapable of getting through the weapons using physical or astral means. This means that the Yaramir will be great cover for the trio against Hashirama's more minor attacks, since it's capable of expanding into a half dome, and if Hashirama is hit directly by the Totsuka Blade, he is probably screwed since it should be capable of cutting him in half like butter. Keep in mind though, that is a very big if, since even in the scenario where Hashirama tries to block the Totsuka blade with wood style, like he did against Madara's sword, once he sees that it's clearly cutting through everything, Hashirama would simply choose to dodge, which he shouldn't have much trouble doing given Sage Mode's precognition. So, despite the fact that the Totsuka blade would work if it lands, the only scenario where I could actually see Itachi getting a clean hit is if both Obito and Nagato managed to put a crap ton of pressure on Hashirama to distract him, which will be difficult to do since he has a massive power advantage over them. At this point, I've talked a lot about the possible win conditions the Akatsuki trio has, and now it's finally time to get into how Hashirama can win. Hashirama's best way to win this fight is to take Obito down first, since without his phasing ability, Itachi and Nagato have no chance of surviving a wood-style onslaught. And the way to gain the edge over Obito is actually fairly simple, because no one in the trio has a way to deal with Hashirama's wood clones. Madara specifically says that he's the only one who could ever tell Hashirama apart from his wood clones, meaning even Izuna, who possessed the Mangekyo Sharingan, was unable to do so. This poses a massive issue for the trio because it means that in order to win, not only do they have to land extremely niche win conditions like Kamui and the Totsuka blade, they also have to pray to God that they can actually hit the right Hashirama, because the clones are completely indiscernible from the original. Plus, if Obito ends up accidentally warping a wood clone into the Kamui dimension, then phasing is completely off the table, since a clone would be waiting on the other side to slaughter whoever appears in the dimension. And, as crazy as it sounds, even Hashirama's wood clones are much stronger than the trio individually, because we see in the war arc that when Ten Tails Obito starts to charge up Biju bombs to fire at the Alliance, one of Hashirama's clones says that it can deflect them to the ocean with deep forest emergence. The only reason this didn't end up happening is because after overhearing Hashirama, Obito formed a barrier around the Alliance to prevent the strategy from working. But it still confirms that even Hashirama's clones have the ability to deflect Ten Tails Biju bombs, which puts them far above the likes of Edo Nagato, Itachi, and Rinnegan Obito. To make things worse, even if Obito doesn't accidentally take a wood clone into his dimension, they still serve as a pretty decent counter to his ability to phase. Since when two people are fighting Obito at once, as long as they go for mutual strikes, it's possible to force Obito to phase when he's on the offensive, and even land a hit if they're fast enough. Considering that both Fu and Torune figured this out in a relatively short amount of time after first confronting Obito, I don't think that it's far-fetched for Hashirama to come up with a strategy like this if the fight drags out for a while. Honestly, as long as Hashirama makes his wood clones, even in the absolute worst scenario, it would probably result in a stalemate where the trio is unable to take Hashirama down due to the wood clones being ridiculously strong, as well as identical to himself, and Hashirama can't figure out a way around Obito's phasing. And even in this case, Obito would be the one to run out of stamina first, so when the moment he can no longer phase comes, it would be an undisputed victory for Hashirama. In my opinion, the only way the Akatsuki trio could legitimately beat Hashirama is if they're capable of taking him out using Kamui or the Totsuka blade prior to Hashirama making wood clones. But since Hashirama is fighting three exceptionally strong opponents, I do think that he would start to make clones fairly quickly to stop himself from potentially being overwhelmed, which means that the window of time the trio has to win is extremely small. Couple this with the fact that their win conditions are extremely hard to pull off against Hashirama, even without the wood clones, and I would give Hashirama the win 9 times out of 10. After all, he certainly isn't called the god of shinobi for nothing. Thanks for watching. If you want to watch another video by me, make sure to check out this one, where I talk about Team Taka versus every Jinchuriki. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. Later!